Российская группа пользователей Progress представляет доклад Тома Баскома на Европейской конференции пользователей Progress 2012 года в Манчестере. Доклад посвящен рассмотрению причин перехода на более свежие версии OpenEdge и преимуществ, которые вы при этом получите.
I'm Tom Bascom. I've been working with Progress since 1987, so I've had a few upgrades. I have a couple of hats that I wear. I work for DBA Praise and White Star Software. DBA Praise is a monitoring and alerting service. We simplify the job of managing and monitoring the world's best business applications. And we all have the world's best business applications, right? Yes. Or we'll do consulting work for you if you need that kind of work. So anybody who's looking for anything like that, feel free to talk to me later. Enough of the sales pitch. So since we're all here because we're interested in upgrading and reasons to upgrade, I think it's only fair to get a little information from the audience about where you are in your OpenEdge cycle. So anybody here running OpenEdge 11.1? 11.1. All right, awesome. Is that in production or development? A little bit of both. Okay. So, how about 11.0? A couple of people are on 11.0, haven't gone to 11.1 yet. All right, got a few of those. 10.2b. 10.2b. Okay. Quite a few there. A. Not so many. Good. If you're on 10.2a, you really ought to get to 10.2b. How about 10.1? Less. Okay. Now, it's okay. You don't have to be embarrassed about any of the rest of this because you are at a session about upgrading, so it's okay. It's all right. 10.0. Nobody at 10.0. Okay. 9.1e. Okay, we've got a few people that'll admit to that. That's good. Other V9. You have customers. You're not actually doing that. I got them all. Anybody older than V9? Okay, Mike, you should just hang your head and shake and leave. So really, nobody other than Mike is older than V9? So I don't have to drag anybody out of the Stone Age? Excellent. Excellent. So what's the Windows mix? How many of you are Windows-oriented people? Oh, that's really too bad. So I assume the rest of you are Unix. What's the Unix-Linux split? So Linux first. Okay, Unix but not Linux. Okay. Character? Anybody still running character app? Yeah, all right. Good people. And the rest of you are GUI apps, I guess. Web apps. No GUI, but web. Okay. Awesome. Okay, so that's good. We've got a good mix of people. We have a lot of potential for upgrades. We don't have anybody that's so far back in the Stone Age that we should just start over. So on we go. So kind of the oldest stuff that we have in the room is a little bit of version 9. And the thing to know about version 9 is that the design work was done in the mid-90s. Think about that for a minute, the mid-90s. How long ago was that? That was a really long time ago. Version 9 was released in 1998. That was when the initial release was, so that kind of gives you an idea where the code base starts. 91E04, Service Pack 4, that's the last release of version 9 that there will ever be. There aren't going to be any updates, there aren't going to be any fixes, no bug fixes, nothing's happening with version 9. So if you got version 9, you're basically out there alone. Support is whatever support can remember about version 9, which isn't necessarily a whole lot. There's been a lot of turnover, a lot of new people. People have learned OpenEdge 10. They've forgotten a lot of what they knew about version 9. If you have a version 9 problem, and it's not a kind of generic problem that you can still have in version 10, you're probably not going to get a lot of help. And version 9 could be a little bit challenging to get to run on a modern platform like Windows 8. I'm not sure I'd want to try that install. It was hard enough with Windows 7. So as the platforms underneath your software change, you have difficulties running it going forward. And these really old versions cost you more from a maintenance perspective. Your maintenance fee is higher to be running an old, obsolete release, just like it is on your hardware and your operating system. Your hardware vendors and your operating system vendors are charging you more for old hardware, for old software, if they support it at all. So staying on something that is almost 20 years old now is really not a really beneficial thing for you to be doing. So just to kind of remind people what the 90s were all about. If you recognize any of the ladies here, you're from the 90s. And our technology was quite a bit different back in the 90s too. We had CRT monitors on our desks. Sony Walkman, that was what is that? That's a Discman. That was state of the art, leading edge back in the 90s. You don't see those around anymore.
The middle ones,
Sorry?
those in the middle, I see sometimes.
Yeah, well, you do see that sort of thing, but there are some notable differences. When was the last time you saw somebody walking around in shoes like that?
Yesterday.
Gus, were you supposed to be in that part of town? Okay, so there were some things that in the 90s really weren't part of the design points that would be going into software at that point in time. The security and privacy issues that we deal with today really weren't at the forefront of anybody's mind then. Yeah, some people thought about them, but they weren't the kind of key, crucial things that are part of our software designs now. So if you have software that was designed in the 90s, either it's Progress version 9 or it's your application that was originally designed in the 90s, you probably have some weaknesses in the security and the privacy area, or you have a lot of duct tape and band-aids holding stuff together. Another thing that people really didn't spend a lot of time thinking about in the 90s was massively multi-core systems everywhere. I mean, an SMP box with 4 cores in it was a big deal in the 90s. Now you've got 4 cores in your phone. Servers with hundreds of gigabytes of RAM. That wasn't something that existed in the 90s. You didn't have those kinds of systems to work with. Wi-Fi. Anybody have Wi-Fi in the 90s? 1999, you could buy an Apple MacBook with the first AirPorts. That's when that basically rolled out. Terabyte hard drives. In the 90s, we were still measuring hard drives in megabytes, not terabytes, not gigabytes even. Solid-state disks. We didn't have solid-state disks in the 90s. These are all technology things that have changed the landscape significantly since that point in time. Virtualization. There wasn't anything going on with virtualization in the 90s. Cloud computing. Clouds. Cloudy day was a day to bring an umbrella. The web. So the web was out there in the late 90s, but there are a lot of parts of the web that are integral to our applications that weren't really developed at that point in time. We didn't have SOAP, we didn't have XML, DOM, ZAX, JSON, and REST interfaces. Those things really weren't there until either very, very late in the 90s or the early 2000s. Things like iPhones and Android, those weren't there then. All these social features that we hear about now, not in the 90s. So progress from the 90s, when people are looking for, wow, can I do a WSDL SOAP interface with Progress 9.1e? And people say, well, it's not really going to work all that well. It's because it was designed so long ago that those things weren't really considerations. So just a little bit on the phone thing. So if you were in the 90s and somebody told you that you would have Unix running on your phone, that you would have a multi-core processor running at 1 gigahertz or higher, that it would have a gigabyte of system RAM, and you'd have 8 to 64 gigabytes of storage for your stuff on your phone, and it would have built-in networking, what would you have thought? You'd have thought they were from another planet, some kind of alien science fiction movie. In 1995, what we had to work with was Linux 1, Windows 95, running on things like Pentium Pros at 200 megahertz. And a gig of RAM really was just not something that you ever saw outside of the big data center. It just wasn't around. So, anybody still feeling good about running version 9? Other than, you probably have to because your application runs on version 9. It does work. It does work. It's very solid. But it doesn't support newfangled things. So how about OpenEdge 10? What's the environment that OpenEdge 10 was sort of created around? Well, first thing that happened was search engines were much more prevalent as we come into the new century. And so changing progress to OpenEdge was really good because it meant that when you Google something, you might actually get a result that was meaningful. It's way easier to Google OpenEdge and get some results that you like than Googling progress. OpenEdge 10 was first released in 2003. Very late in 2003, but still it was almost 10 years ago. The current release of OpenEdge is 10.2b.07. And OpenEdge 11 has been released. So what we're looking at with OpenEdge 10 is something that's in its twilight. Okay, just to set the stage here. But OpenEdge 10 had significant scalability features added to it over what you had in version 9. This big emphasis of the initial release of OpenEdge 10 was scalability, increasing the limits, making it so that you could do bigger, better things. So we got things like 64-bit row IDs. So if you were having challenges getting all of your data into a V9 database, OpenEdge 10 made it so that you could put enormously more amounts of data in your database. Type 2 storage areas. Type 2 storage areas are the foundation for all of the modern features of the database. So every time Rich and the engine crew come up with some nice new feature, they're almost always going to say, well, you got to have type 2 storage areas. So you want to adopt those. 64-bit executables on all the platforms, except Windows GUI. But this enables you to address large amounts of memory, rather than being limited to just 2 bytes per process. Large files. So back in the version 9 days, having files that were limited to 2 gigabytes in size was pretty normal, at least back at the beginning. Throughout the end days of version 9, we started to see large file support rolling out on each of the individual platforms. By version 10, we have it on all of the platforms. Having 32,000 storage areas. So this is all part of the support of enormously large databases. You can have quite a bit. The maximum area size being a petabyte means that your maximum data size is 32,000 petabytes. Dash B, you now have a limit of 1 billion on Dash B. It used to be, the published limit was 500,000, so you could actually go higher than that. But now it's enormously bigger, so you can have great big amounts of memory assigned to your buffer pool. This is all in support of scalability. And large index keys. So instead of being restricted to 200 bytes for an index, we now have almost 2,000 bytes available for an index. These are all scalability things that help you to have much bigger data sets that you're working with. OpenEdge 10 also addressed a lot of the security deficiencies from the version 9 days. So in OpenEdge 10, all the wire protocols are encrypted, so you no longer have clear text being passed around all around the countryside. You have the transparent data encryption feature, which, like many new features, requires you to have type 2 storage areas. This encrypts data at rest. So if you make a backup tape and you send it off to your offsite storage and the truck breaks down and the tape's dumped out all over the road and someone picks one up, you don't need to worry about it because it's encrypted, or it can be. The runtime user enforcement. So the old way of doing security was to use the _user file. And that's all compile time security back in the older releases of progress. You now have an option to make that runtime security. So that's a nice little tightening up of things. And there's a client principal object and all the things that go with that. Peter Judge had a nice talk about that earlier this morning, so I won't go into the gory details there. The 4GL and productivity features of progress were greatly enhanced throughout the version 10 time frame. We got object-oriented programming. We can now create classes and put our code together that way, which is really kind of nice. It's a great little set of features. We got a lot of XML support. We now have support for the DOM. We have support for a SAX reader and a writer. Pro data sets can read and write XML directly. All that came with version 10. You don't have any of that in version 9. We have the Eclipse-based integrated development environment, which is a huge step forward in your ability to program things compared to the old version 9 style UIB app builder kind of world, or if you're a character guy using the progress editor. Anybody still use the progress editor? Oh. Well, okay, I'll be truthful. I'm still a VI, Emacs kind of guy myself. So. But OpenEdge Architect is a great tool and a really excellent way to do development. We have the GUI for .NET features, so we have a much more modern user interface available for Windows platforms than what we had prior with version 9, where you had to do so many things with ActiveXs and that kind of control, where you had to bring in a lot of external stuff to get a good-looking application done. Structured error handling. So this is kind of part and parcel with the object-oriented features, but you can now do try and catch kinds of blocks in your code, which is really much more modern than the methods that we had before. And pro data sets are in the later versions of OpenEdge 10.2b, starting to support reading and writing JSON objects, which is a nice little feature. Then we have OpenEdge BPM, Business Process Management, which we heard a lot about last year. We're still hearing about this year, so I guess we're keeping it. That's good. And of course, the most important thing was the 4GL got renamed to the APL. Okay, that's a joke. Personally, I will never call it the APL. It just doesn't work for me. It's always been the 4GL. It will always be the 4GL. Gus and I may start a petition about that and see if we can get it renamed back.
I look forward to the button.
Online administration features. So OpenEdge 10 really went a long ways down the road. It's not complete yet, but there's a whole lot of great stuff that you can do online to administer your database. You can do an online apply of the DF file. So while the database is up and running, you can apply a DF file, you can add tables, you can add fields, all of this without having to take the database down. You can add extents to the database online. So if you're starting to run out of space, you need to allocate some more space, you can do that online. You can make certain parameter changes online. So if you want to increase the size of your lock table, this happens to people fairly frequently where they run out of locks, you can do an online ProUtil and increase the number of locks. You can increase Big B. Several parameters are available to you there. The after image management daemon. This is a great feature for. Is there anybody who's not running after imaging? Okay. This is your solution. The after image management daemon. This allows you to very easily set up after imaging and have it basically take care of itself. If you're not running after imaging, then your data is either worthless or you don't really need to keep your job. One or the other. Set up the after imaging management daemon is very straightforward. All you have to do is make an online backup. There are some parameters that you can add to the online backup that will configure the daemon, start it, and basically just launch it and get it going. And you don't have to do anything except add the extents, which you can also do online. So you don't even have to take your database down to do it. Diagnostic capabilities, another big thing that's been added in the OpenEdge 10 space. So the log file format has been standardized and greatly improved. So now all our log file messages come with a timestamp on them. They're all in a standard format. They all give you, and it's a format that's the same across all the products. So the app servers, the database, everything uses a similar kind of format. We got back a feature that disappeared for a little while. This was this SIG user 1 4GL stack trace. So what that is you can send a signal to a running process, and it'll tell you where in the process you are. So if you've got some process running and it's running away, or it's doing something bad, it's a batch process, or maybe it's a user that won't answer their phone, you want to know what's going on, you send it a signal, and you get a 4GL stack trace that'll tell you what line of code is being executed. Very, very handy in any kind of debugging scenario. That was around for a little while in 8.3 and early version 9, and then it disappeared. Then it came back. We have something called the client statement cache. This is a capability from within Promon for the VSTs, you can see what database statement a user is executing. So if you ever have a situation where somebody is very, very active, but you don't know what they're doing, you can use the client statement cache to find out. And it'll tell you what statement they're executing in what program. Or from SQL, it'll show you the SQL statement. So if it's a SQL client, you can actually see what SQL is. Data block checksums. So this is a reliability feature because databases are becoming much bigger. There's more opportunity for corruption to creep in. So the checksums help to make sure that the data that you read in and that is in memory is the same as the data that it's supposed to be. And we have user-specific table and index stats. So now not only can we see where the activity in the database is on a global basis, but we can see what tables, what indexes are the most active, and we can see which users are the most active users of those tables and indexes and what kind of activity on a per user basis is going on. So this gives you a very fine-grained diagnostic for looking into a lot of performance issues. And of course, type 2 storage areas. They're worth a slide all of their own. So, as I mentioned earlier, type 2 storage areas are the foundation for all of the new database features. Everything that the engine crew does, pretty much, depends on type 2 storage areas for good performance for the features there. A type 2 area has a cluster size. That means that the blocks are organized into groups. So instead of allocating one block at a time, you allocate 8 blocks at a time, 64 blocks at a time, or 512. The other thing that's really special about a type 2 block is that the data in that block only comes from one table. In a type 1 block, which is the old style, the data in that block could be mixed from lots of different tables. So you would have a block, and in that block you might have a customer record, you might have 2 or 3 order records, you might have a salesperson's vacation record, you might have some notes, you could have anything in there. So it's very inefficient in terms of access. It's extremely efficient in terms of the space that it uses, but you might have noticed that disk space just keeps growing and growing and growing by leaps and bounds. So having space to store things is much less of a problem than being able to quickly get to them. So the type 2 areas help you a lot with that. It reduces the scatter of your database, which is really good because it improves your I/O efficiency. You now have tunable create and toss limits. These are the numbers that control whether or not a new record can be added to a block and whether that block is kept on the RM chain. And these are now tunable by table, so you don't have just one for the whole database or one for a particular area, which helps to make your storage, type 2 areas in general, make your storage utilization much better. And you get huge performance improvements if you do all this correctly. Other performance improvements in the OpenEdge 10 space, because it was a new release, that meant that Progress could change the base technology that it's compiled on. So instead of compiling on these really ancient operating systems, they were able to move up a couple of levels, and now our base compile is on stuff that's at least in the 2000s, not the early 1990s. We have things like a multi-threaded binary dump, which is a huge performance improvement. If you were in the room prior to this talk, you heard Rich talk about a lot of the performance stuff that he's done in the last couple of releases, particularly around index rebuild. So index rebuild is now potentially 3 to 5 times faster than it used to be. So if you've ever had an index rebuild and you need to spend all night or worse yet, a whole weekend on it, it's now much more reasonable. Huge improvements to the latch algorithms in 10.1c and 10.2b. So if you have a large, high-throughput system where you do a lot of reading of data, that's now much faster than it used to be, which means that things like your reports and your data extracts run faster. And a feature called the alternate buffer pool, which is basically a set of buffers within the -B space that are treated differently than the primary buffers. Very nice performance feature there, too. But even though we did all these things in OpenEdge 10, there are still things that were not really being thought of back in the early 2000s. Because OpenEdge 10, the technology base was dreamed up, thought of back around 2000, 2001, 2002. So some of the things that we still weren't thinking about then were servers with hundreds of gigabytes of RAM. That was still kind of out there. Having multi-core systems everywhere. Still in the early 2000s, that wasn't on the radar. You really started to hear about that in 05 or thereabouts. That's when people started coming up with these multi-core systems. Solid-state disks, they came out of nowhere. Nobody was really thinking about solid-state disks as a normal kind of thing that's available on every device. Even 3 or 4 years ago, that just wasn't something that you would have expected. Now you can't buy a laptop without one. Well, close to not being able to buy a laptop without one. Cloud computing, another new thing that wasn't out there at the time that these things were being designed. The whole iPhones, Android, and social as a paradigm. So since OpenEdge 10 was launched, here's some of the things that have happened out in the world. 2004 is when Facebook was launched. That was after OpenEdge 10 was already out there. YouTube was 2005. Twitter and Microsoft Zoom. You gotta put some fun things in there. The iPhone's only 5 years old. Android came a couple of years after that. I mean, these things are all very, very new. Your Kindle, the MacBook Air, that's when the SSD revolution really started to take off, was when the MacBook Air came out. You kind of see the writing on the wall at that point. But before that, nobody was really thinking about it. The last couple of years hasn't been so much hardware and software, it's been things like the patent wars. So now we've got patents on every stupid little thing, which makes innovation a lot harder for some of us. You have things like the chain of trust in SSL security certificates having been broken last year with the Dutch Certificate Authority, and there were a couple others that had a little issue there. And this year you've got things like quad-core phones. It's the best I could come up with for 2012. So we're coming to the end of the life for OpenEdge 10. We're not here yet, but you can see the writing on the wall. All the really new, cool stuff is starting to happen in OpenEdge 11. You see things going into OpenEdge 11.1, and some of them are being backported. So you see them show up in 10.2b06, 10.2b07, but they're not starting there. They're coming from OpenEdge 11. They're being brought back into 10.2b. That's not going to go on forever. It's not going to go on much longer. I don't work for Progress, so this isn't official. I don't know anything, but the writing's on the wall. If you're on 10, you need to start thinking about 11. There will be a 10.2b Service Pack 8, but it's an open question. Will that end up being the same kind of release as 9.1e04? Is that kind of the end of the road, or maybe there's a couple more? But there's probably not a 10.2c in my opinion. So you can get some more information. Of course, most of this has already happened about OpenEdge 10, but these are maybe some presentations you might want to look at if you didn't happen to get a chance to see them. There was an object orientation theory and practice talk. There was a nice talk on OpenEdge GUI for .NET. I had a nice talk about storage optimization, type 2 areas, for anybody who missed that. Identity management was this morning. I talked a lot about the client principal object. If security issues are important to you, that would be a really good one to pay attention to. Rich had a database performance talk that was immediately prior to this one. Another great one to get the slides and look at if you missed. And the only one that's in the future is Mike Fetchner is going to talk about OpenEdge architect a little bit later today. So from a development tools perspective, that might be a good place to spend some time if you have interest there. Now, OpenEdge 11 is kind of where we're headed. And it was launched about a year ago. So it's been out in the marketplace for almost a year now. The big new feature in OpenEdge 11 is multi-tenancy. And that's basically the capability of allowing multiple companies or other entities to share the same physical structure, but to be logically distinct from each other, which is a really cool feature. And OpenEdge BPM was the other big thing in OpenEdge 11, was being able to have these BPM features, the ability to manage business processes externally from the application. A lot of other good stuff in OpenEdge 11. One of the things that we got was 32 and 64-bit R code compatibility back. So now we don't have to worry about, oh, is this platform a 32-bit platform or a 64-bit platform, and keeping the R code together has been cleaned up. That's a nice convenience feature. The .NET component support for batch clients. So in the original .NET rollout, it was called GUI for .NET or something like that. And it's very focused on the user interface components. Well, there's a lot of .NET components that are not UI components that are very interesting and useful to use, but we couldn't use them in the initial rollout. We now have them with the OpenEdge 11 stuff. So you can use them in your app servers, you can use them in your batch programming as long as you're on the Windows platform. We got improved support for large objects, input blocking statement support for UDFs, user-defined functions. Sorry about the TLA there. So traditionally, since we first were able to create user-defined functions in version 8, there have been restrictions on where you could use them, particularly if they block for input from a user. Those restrictions have been lifted with version 11, which is a good thing. The JSON object API in version 11 is much more powerful than the support that is in the late version 10 releases. So there was really a very limited JSON support in 10.2b. There's much more flexible JSON support in version 11. ProDataSet can now deal with XML schema, which version 10.2b cannot do. You have a buffer object serialized row. So instead of having to serialize the entire buffer, you can do it row by row now, which is a feature that was important to a lot of people. On the security side of things, there are callbacks supported in the authentication mechanism now, so you can have an external callback invoked. And there's a capability to encode passwords. So traditionally, what you've had to do if you had a password, a user ID and a password on the command line, was you had to put them in clear text, which is really problematic. A lot of auditors don't like that. So you would then have to put them in a PF file, and you have to have security on the PF file. But it's still clear text, and it still gives heartaches to the auditors. So now you can encrypt them. They're still on the command line. They're still in that file. You still have to protect them. But it's at least a lot less obvious what the values are. Step in the right direction. A huge thing is temp table statistics and logging. As we've matured our applications and our designs have become a lot more sophisticated, we've been using more and more temp tables, especially if you're following anything that resembles the OpenEdge reference architecture. You're passing temp tables around between different components of your system all the time. And this is very different from if you created your application back in the 80s or the 90s, or maybe you have vendor application from that period where used a lot of shared data structures. Now we're passing these temp tables, we're building pro data sets. It's a much more complicated world. And from an analysis and diagnostic point of view, we've been blind to what is happening with temp tables. The new statistics and logging that we can get about the temp tables now tell us things about how many temp tables we have, how big they are, when they're being instantiated, when they're being deleted. It gives us a much better capability of understanding how that part of our applications works. Another feature that we got, when the SQL 92 engine was added to the database, one of the things that the user liked to brag about was this table scan capability where you could scan all the data in a table without using an index, and how fast it was. Well, you know, it's really great that the SQL engine has this really fast ability to grab data. How many of you guys have applications that are built on the SQL engine? Right, that's what I thought. So the 4GL really needed to have this feature, and we're getting that feature with version 11. So now in version 11, you'll be able to do things like for each customer, no index, and you'll have a much more rapid return of those records. Now, that's only useful if you don't care about what order you're in. But a lot of times when you're doing a table scan, when you're deliberately doing a table scan, that's okay. So this is a great feature for that kind of situation. And the 4GL will be able to do the fast table drop as well in version 11. So those are also excellent capabilities that we'll be picking up. And it's not on the slide, but one of my favorite version 11 features that's coming is a sub-second pause. So we'll be able to pause for periods of less than a second. Really small feature, but all right, about time. So some sessions that are about version 11, or OpenEdge 11 kinds of things. Dan Foreman did a talk on temp table monitoring yesterday. That was a really nice talk. The ABL in OpenEdge 11, Gus did that yesterday, so sorry that's gone by as well. There's a Maximizing Productivity with Partners Developer Studio, which is today, but that was earlier this morning, so sorry. One of the changes in OpenEdge 11 is that OpenEdge Architect is now known as Progress Developer Studio. Not quite as bad as ABL, but I really like Architect better. And then there's a multi-tenancy workshop later this afternoon, so if you're interested in multi-tenancy, that would be a good place to get to. So that's kind of the differences between the various versions and the features that you get by moving ahead. But how do you move on from the 90s? So say you're stuck in the 90s, either because you're using version 9 or because you're using an application that was largely designed for that era. So just because you have, of those of you that are running 11.1, did you create your application in 11.1? Anybody? Did you create that application in 11.0? 10 dot something? 9 dot something? Aha. So see, you're stuck in the 90s, whether you know it or not. So there are some things that you might want to do beyond just installing a version 11 license and recompiling. So there are some rules that you need to be aware of. If you're going to upgrade, as long as you can compile, you can upgrade. So if you have a compiler license, you can do. What? Yes, you can.
That's what I might not want to.
Oh, well, that's true. You might not want to, but you can. The key thing you have to know, though, is if you have a client-server configuration, the client has to be at the higher release than the server. So you have to upgrade the client either first or at the same time you upgrade the server. The one thing you can't do is upgrade the server first. So the server has to either be at the same time or later than the clients. So if you're running Unix, it's pretty easy. All you do is recompile and push out the R code. Unix is very straightforward. particularly if it's a character application. There's no real effort involved. If you're running Windows, I'm sorry, I can't help you very much. But you probably have some sort of procedure that you're using to package up your application and to distribute it to the desktops, and that's different for everybody. So I can't really describe exactly how you do that. But you recompile, you package it up somehow, and you distribute it out there. The basic server upgrade process really isn't all that different whether you're running Windows or whether you're running Unix. You shut down, you make a backup, you truncate your BI file, you do whatever it is you do to make your new release active. On Unix, a lot of times that's just renaming a directory or changing the DLC environment variable. For Windows, that might just mean you use a different set of icons. However you go about that. If it's a major version upgrade, you run ProUtil convert 910 and then update the VSTs and recompile. If it was not a major version upgrade, then all you're doing is restarting. You don't need to do anything. Just restart. Maybe you run update VSTs if there were some changes there. Then you restart, and your server has been upgraded. This takes, well, the whole thing might take you 15 or 20 minutes. Obviously, you test this. You don't do this for the first time in production. Okay, please. You know, everybody has test systems, right? Anybody going to confess to not having a test system? Good. But the backup's important. Don't skip the backup. Now, Progress does ship some utilities within the Progress installation for doing things like conversions on old systems. So sometimes you'll make the mistake of having a backup from an old system, and you don't have that old version of Progress available to you anymore. And within the bin directory, there are a bunch of subdirectories for older versions of the utilities, and you can use those, but it's kind of a pain in the neck. So after you're converted, after you've got your server converted, there's a couple of things you should do right away. So I'm assuming that you're converting to either 10.2b07, which is the current 10.2b release, or 11.1. I would not, at this point in time, convert to 11.0, and I wouldn't upgrade any version 10s to anything less than 10.2b06. I'd probably go to 7, though, because that's the service pack that's most recent. So the first couple of things you should do are add a couple of the new server tuning parameters. These are basically harmless. There's no real downside to any of these. LRE skips gives you the advantages of the work that Rich did with the LRU mechanism. And the prefetch parameters make it so that any client-server traffic that you have will be much more efficient than it has been up to now. Now, you may not see any benefit from these, but you won't see a downside. So I strongly recommend that you go ahead and do them. If you have a system with a high load and a lot of activity, then you may see some nice benefits from this stuff too. Another thing that you should do anytime that you have the opportunity is make sure that your table and index statistics are being gathered. So we have had for quite some time these table stat and index stat VSTs that collect a lot of data about the activity within the database. But by default, it only collects the data for the first 50 tables and the first 50 indexes. So when you have a performance problem and you realize that you need to know something about the activity in the tables and the indexes, and you go to get that data, the interesting tables are hardly ever the first 50. It's almost always the 51st or the 52nd or somewhere in there. So what you want to do is you want to find out how many tables and how many indexes you have so that you can correctly set the table range size and the index range size. And a good time to do this is any time that you upgrade, if you aren't doing it routinely anyway. So here's a nice little bit of code that will figure that out for you. And whatever numbers you get back from T and I, round them up a little bit. Don't go crazy, but round them up a little bit. so that when you add a new table or you add a new index, you don't have to do this all over again. As I mentioned before, a couple of pro-util things to do, particularly if this is an older database that you've moved forward from version 8 to version 9 to version 10 to version 11. Enable large files, just in case you haven't already done that. And update VSTs, so that you have all the newest VSTs, all the newest diagnostic capabilities available to you. If you have not gone to the trouble of creating type 2 storage areas, you don't have to do that in order to upgrade. So you can upgrade and you'll keep all of your type 1 areas. And if you've been going from version 8 to version 9 to version 10, then probably all your data is in the schema area. So I see a lot of people who were in my talk earlier, yesterday. Should we have any data in the schema area? Sorry. That's right, we should not have any data in the schema area. So we want to move it out of the schema area into type 2 storage areas. This is a very simple structure file. It's kind of the minimal structure file for a reasonable type 2 allocation. So the schema area shouldn't have any data in it. It still has to exist because you have to have all of your data definitions in there. But we create one data area, one index area, and one area for large objects. Move your data into there. Make sure you have after imaging, because everybody should have after imaging, unless your resume is right up to date and ready to go. You want to have after imaging. And then you move your data into it. If it's a small database, then you can use utilities like table move, a really small database. If it's a larger database, then you want to do a dump and load. Now, keep in mind, you are not required to do a dump and load just to upgrade. You only need to do that in order to make changes to your storage areas and the characteristics of them. You don't have to do it at the same time that you upgrade, but you're not going to get the benefits, the database benefits from those upgrades until you do eventually get to type 2 areas. For anything except a very small database, the only real way to do that is via a dump and load. You might, later on, you might decide you need to add some storage areas, or you might want to change the rows per block or the cluster size, and those would be other reasons to dump and load. So that's how to get from the 90s into the modern era in the simplest way. It's not really all that complicated, but if you need help, I know a consultant who will work with you on that. I do. Talk to me later. Actually, I know several. There are quite a few in the room. Now, looking ahead from getting out of the 90s, there are some cool things coming down the road. Some of this is, remember, I'm not a Progress employee, so I'm just making this up. I don't even have to put the disclaimer up there because nothing I say matters to anybody. But there are some things that are probably coming in the 11.x time frame. So horizontal partitioning is something that Progress has talked about. We saw that in the general session yesterday. I think Karen put up a slide that said something about horizontal partitioning. And that's the ability to do things like take parts of your data and say, well, this 2011 data, I want it to be historical and I want it to be read-only. So you carve that out into a partition, and you no longer, maybe you don't have to back it up. You don't have to have it treated the same way as your live data. We might get, or we'll get things like paged result sets. So currently, when you do things like you have a web page that's showing customers, you show customer 1 through 50, and then you want to show 51 through 100, and like that. So there's a new mechanism to make that much easier to code from the SQL side of things. If you really need, if we got additional buffer pools, now we have the main buffer pool, we have this alternate buffer pool. Some people would like to see more than 2 buffer pools, so maybe we'll get to see that someday. Larger block sizes are something that might be coming down the road eventually. I'm not saying anybody's committed to anything. Remember, I don't work for Progress. Additional improvements in the latch structures and throughput side of things are something that we can pretty much count on because they're always doing stuff like that. They're always finding ways to make performance quicker. Compressed backups is something that people have been asking for a long time and that might eventually find its way into the product. An ability to grow a variable extent to a certain size, that might be something that we get to see. These are all things to look forward to and be excited about. You might be looking forward for a long time. The horizon for enhancement requests is sometimes quite long. And of course, there will probably be extensions to the VSTs and the other database features. So, our conclusion. These are kind of the reasons why you should upgrade, why you should stay up to date. So, new releases are actively supported by progress customer support. Your new releases are where the focus is going to be. That's where the training is, that's where their experience is. They're right on top of new releases all the time. So, if you want the best support, you want to be on the closest thing to a new release that you can be. New releases are going to work better on modern operating systems. So Microsoft's not standing still. The Unix vendors aren't standing still. They're all making changes to their platforms and their underlying infrastructure. And Progress can't predict what those things are going to look like 10 years from now. You're upgrading your Microsoft desktop. Why aren't you upgrading Progress? You should be. You've got to keep them at least relatively close to each other. You're not still running Windows 95, right? Anybody still running Windows 95 in the enterprise? Matt, you are? Okay. So why would you be running Progress version 9? That's kind of how that works. Your new releases almost always contain significant performance enhancements. You get those for free. You don't really even have to do much to pick up a lot of those performance enhancements. All you do is upgrade, and things should run at least a little bit faster most of the time. Sometimes you have to do something to take advantage of the new feature, like convert to Type 2 storage areas, but a lot of times you will get at least some performance enhancement merely through the act of upgrading. And from a programming and development perspective, if you're looking for new features, they're going to be coming in new releases. Progress isn't going to put new features in old releases for very long. It might do a little bit of that backporting because the installed base is fairly significant still for 10.2b, but that's not going to go on forever. So if you're looking for new stuff a year from now, you really ought to be running version 11. Okay. So that's it for the talk. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Any cost
Sorry.
any cost implications of upgrading without talking about customers?
Okay. So you're asking about the cost of upgrading? Well, officially you have to talk to a salesperson about that. But as long as your maintenance is paid up, the upgrades are no cost now. There used to be back in version 8 days this thing called a platform change fee. So if you went from HP Unix to IBM Unix, you would have to pay a fee for that. They did away with that in the version 9 time frame, and now all the upgrades, as long as your maintenance is up to date, are no cost. Yes, that's correct. Other questions? Yes, Gus.
I have a comment. The LRU skip parameter that you suggested turning on, a good place to put that is in the server.pf file of the DLC directory.
Startup.pf?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Gus is suggesting a good place to put parameters that you want everything to use would be $DLC/startup.pf. I think that's another question, yes.
If you're already using Type 2 storage areas, would you gain anything for the load being 10 to 11?
Well, I have a whole presentation on that. Not merely because you went from 10 to 11, no. But you might. So, sorry if you didn't hear the question. It was if you have Type 2 storage areas already, is there any benefit to going from 10 to 11 from a performance perspective related to the storage areas? Correct? Yeah. No. But you might want to review some things about how your storage areas are configured. If you made changes, the dump and load might help you in terms of improving scatter and that kind of thing. but that would be true even if you stayed at the release that you're at. Okay. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.